There's more to engaging with reality than being a scientist in a white lab coat. But we need to be able to clearly distinguish fact from fantasy, or fact from merely fertile flights of the imagination. And we want to be rigorous there and rational there. And it's not that there's no place for mere creativity that's not on the rails of rationality.
Well, look, fair enough then. But I mean, then partly what we are disputing is the relative import and of those two domains. Let's say the poetic and the fictional, and the rational,
and the status of religion now in that.
Well, I have a hard time reconciling that to some degree with your more what would you say, formal statements about the problem, because your mechanism, the mechanism that you put forth above all, outside of truth, is rationality. And it isn't clear to me if you're willing to allow the utility of spiritual experience, which you do, and if you're willing to make, what would you say, allowances for the necessity of the poetic imagination, exactly how it is that is also encapsulated under the rubric of pure rationality. See, and here's something, you can tell me what you think about this, and I've been thinking a lot about what Sam and I have been talking about, by the way. You know, so I'm making the case in my writing that democratic institutions not only grew out of the Judeo-Christian substrate, but that they're properly ensconced within that substrate. But I'm also perfectly aware that not every religious or poetic system gives rise to democratic institutions, first, and also that there are Christian substructures, maybe the most obviously in the case of the Russian Orthodox Church,
right,
where the same metaphysical principles apply, but out of which a democracy did not emerge. And so it does seem to me that what we have in the West is the consequence of the interplay between the fantasy-predicated, poetic Judeo-Christian tradition and the rational critique that was aimed at that by the Enlightenment figures. And that seems to me to mirror something like the proper balance between the right hemisphere and its poetic imagination and the left hemisphere and its critical capacity. And then I would say that part of the way, so one of the questions you brought up was, how do we decide which, let's say, religious intuitions are valid? And I think we do that in part through negotiated agreement, you know, because people have, look, even among the Catholics, say in the medieval time, there was an absolute horror of heresy. So if you were some mendicant monk and you had a profound religious vision, the probability that you were going to be tried as a heretic and burnt at the stake was extremely high, because even the gatekeepers of the religious tradition realized that religious revelation untrammeled by something like community dialogue, something like that, was something of extraordinary danger. And so I would agree with you that the poetic imagination and the ground of religious revelation is something that can lead people dangerously astray. But I would say at the same time that it constitutes the grounds of our initial exploration, and that it's actually ineradicably necessary.
Okay, well, I'll briefly address that, and then I want to ask a question that brings Douglas directly in here. I think this is an instance of what's called the genetic fallacy, the idea that because something emerged the way it did historically, as a matter of historical contingency, it is good, the origin is in fact good and worth maintaining, or that it was in fact necessary, that we couldn't get these good things like democracy any other way, or were unlikely to. And I would say that there's no Abrahamic religion that is the best conceivable womb of democracy or anything else we like, science.
That's a great place to get Douglas involved.
Yeah. So, but I would just add one other category of thinking here. We have what we think is factual and methods by which we derive facts. And I would put rationality there and an empirical engagement with reality. Then we have other good things in life, like fiction and flights of fancy that are pleasing for one reason or another, and could be generative toward the first category. But then we also have, I would acknowledge, and we've spoken about this before, useful fictions and cases, I would hope rare cases where fiction is more adaptive or more useful than the truth. right? That sometimes the truth can be not worth knowing. And I would argue that there are those cases,
Okay,
but they're few and far between.
We should focus on that to some degree.
Yeah, so I wanted to just point to Douglas here and focus on that, because I think your fear, Douglas, is that my style, or Richard Dawkins' style, or Christopher Hitchens' style of anti-theism, just let's just throw the vicars from the rooftops now, because it is time to end this thing. Not literally. Get off Twitter now, but.
That's a hashtag, if ever I heard one.
Yes. Your concern has been that, and I think Jordan shares this, that so much of what is good in our Western developed societies is, at the very least, maintained by maintaining so-called Judeo-Christian values, or the remnants of our past religiosity, and that there is a baby in the bathwater that can be difficult to discern, and we can't empty the tub all at once, and this is very much because there's a zero-sum contest with the religious enthusiasm we see coming from the Muslim world, and of course the Muslim world is all over the world at the moment. So in that contest between an older style of religiosity and theocracy really, and modernity, you are not as eager as I have been to pull up Western religiosity by the roots.
Or chuck the vicars.
Yes.
Yes, I think that's fair. I think I sit metaphorically as well as literally between the two of you. I realized from our conversation in Dublin some of what your concerns are about what Jordan has been saying and what he is saying, and I share some of the concern. I said to you then that I used the analogy of what our friend Eric Weinstein recently described to me as Jesus smuggling. That it was a consequence of a discussion about biologists. What do you do if you're discussing design, intelligent design? You can be okay as long as your own bandwidth on the issue, as long as your own depth of knowledge on the issue is very considerable. You can be okay discussing that biology with somebody, even a fundamentalist Christian, so long as you can follow every step of the way. But the fear will always be that the moment you're not looking, they're going to smuggle Jesus in. Or they'll wait till the moment that you're not comfortable anymore with the argument, the bit when you're at the very end of your cognitive ability, and then they'll, trust me.
There's Jesus. Yes.
There's Jesus. And one of the things I realized from Dublin was, although I think you may not think that Jordan himself is going to try Jesus smuggling on you, you fear that somewhere down the line from what he's saying, somebody else will do that trick.
Yeah, it's worse than that. I actually know the people who are clapping are doing that. I hear from those people on a daily basis, right? So that the segment of Jordan's audience that is very happy to be told they can stay on the riverbank of their traditional Christianity for the most part, and they don't have to get into the stream of totally modern, rigorous, rational thinking about everything from first principles, right? That there's something that the Iron Age scribes got right, and it's right for all time. Those are the applause I'm hearing. And however consciously or not, Jordan is telling them it's okay to stick right there with a shard of the cross.
Okay, well, in Dublin, I actually tried a little conscious Jesus smuggling on Sam to see how that would go in a discussion we had about the central archetype of superheroes, but I'm going to try something a little different tonight. I'm going to try a little direct God smuggling. We won't bother with Jesus. Let's go right to God. Why not? So one of the things I've really tried to do when I've been analyzing religious texts is to take them seriously in the sense that I don't presume that I understand them. And I presume that they're a mystery of sorts. And at least the Bible, for example, is a mystery because we don't really understand the processes by which it was constructed, and we don't understand the processes by which we all agreed collectively over several thousand years to organize the book the way it way it is organized, or to edit it the way that it's edited, and to keep what's in it, and to discard what's not in it, and why it's lasted and why it's had such a huge impact.
I don't want to derail you, but
Yeah.
we do understand that the first part of the process all too well. We know that there was a political and all too human process of voting certain texts in for inclusion, and some were in for centuries and then got jettisoned, and
Sure.
and Revelation came in far later than. I mean, there were whole generations of Christians who lived and died under the banner of the Bible,
Yes.
and it was a different Bible at the time.
Of
They
course,
had the wrong
of
Bible.
course.
So
well, but it's the same issue that we really don't understand. Fair enough, Sam, and I'm not saying that political, etc. considerations didn't enter into it. I'm sure all human considerations entered into it, but there was some collective process of winnowing, and you can attempt to reduce that to economic or political causes, which is generally what secular assessors like Freud and Marx both did, and with a fair degree of success, I might add. But there's still some mysterious assessment of what it is that will be remembered that entered into it. But it's a separate point to some degree. I'm just saying that my point of departure when looking at these texts is one of an essential radical ignorance. I don't assume that I understand the mechanisms by which they were generated or edited or collected or kept or remembered, or why they had the impact they had. Now, I've been thinking a lot about the idea of, let's say, God the Father, because that's a very common archetypal representation of God the Father. So I'm going to tell you an experience that I had that I've never really told any audience about. I had a vision at one point and the vision had to do with a dialogue that I was having with my father. And you have a father, right? And when you're a little kid, you act out your father when you pretend to be a father. And what you're doing when you're acting out your father isn't imitating your father, because you don't duplicate precisely the actions that your father ever took in his life. What you do is you watch your father across multiple contexts, and you abstract out something like a spirit of the father. And then when you're a child, you implement that spirit of the father in your pretend play, and you come to embody that deeply. So the notion is that people can abstract out something like a spirit of the father. And that's part of our mimetic tendency, which is a very powerful human cognitive tendency. And in this vision, I first started to talk with my father, and I would say more with the spirit of my father, because he wasn't actually there. And I would say it was the wisest part of him. And then that sort of transformed into a discussion that I had with a series of ancestral spirits. And then that transformed itself into a vision of God himself, with whom I had a conversation. And this was a visionary experience. And then that all went away, and I spent months and months thinking about it. And I thought, so you guys can tell me what you think about this. And this sort of stretches my cognitive ability to its utmost limit to contemplate such things. But here's a biological argument. I already made the case that a child can extract out the spirit of the father and embody it, and that's necessary insofar as you're going to be a father and a wise one. But we can also extract out the spirit of the father over much longer periods of time, because my father was a father because he imitated his father, who imitated his father, who imitated his father, as far back in time as you can go. And there's a cumulative development of the spirit of the father across time. Now then the question might be, does this spirit of the father have any reality other than the metaphorical? And I would say, damn right it has a reality, and I can describe a biological reality, and I don't know what this says about any background metaphysics, but here's a hypothesis. We know that human beings separated from chimpanzees over the course of the last 7 million years, at least in large part because of human female sexual selectivity. So it was the spirit of femininity collectively that helped elevate us to the degree that we have been elevated above our chimpanzee co-ancestor. But here's something interesting to contemplate. What is it precisely that makes men desirable to women? And so I have a bit of a hypothesis about that. So here's what men do. They get together in productive groups, and they orient themselves toward a certain task. And they produce a hierarchy around that task, because whenever you implement a task, you produce a hierarchy. And they vote up the most competent men to the top of the hierarchy, and then the women select the competent men from the top of the hierarchy. But the vote that determines who the competent men are that are more likely to reproduce is a consequence of male evaluation of men, and that's occurred over millennia. And so there's a spirit of the father that's embedded in the patriarchal hierarchy that acts as the primary selection mechanism that offers men up to women and plays a cardinal role in human evolution. And it looks like we've personified that spirit of the father in our religious imagery. And that's how it looks to me. But then there's something that's even more mysterious and deep about that that's worth considering, is that apparently the entire course of evolutionary history has conspired to produce human beings. And we could argue that it could have been different, but it certainly hasn't been different. And that means that that selective spirit of the father has been part of the process that's generated our very being, and it's certainly possible that that collective spirit of the Father reflects something metaphysically fundamental about the structure of reality itself.
Wait, I was
you
with
want
you
to
up
take a
until the
bite of
last
that?
sentence, yes. Well, insofar as I agree with virtually all of that, I should say that none of that should give comfort to people who want to hold on to this notion that certain of our books might have been revealed by the creator of the universe. Right?
Well, it depends on what you mean by the creator.
Yeah.
Like,
I'm just saying that the world we're living in now is one in which we have whole societies shattered over this notion that some books weren't written by human beings. Right? There's a different class of book. Right? There's a different shelf in the library where the products of almost certainly merely human brains are venerated for all time and considered uneditable and unignorable by the majority of human beings.
yeah, well, it's clear that revelation can devolve into fundamentalism, and that's a real
problem.
So there is a risk in all this always, is an often made critique, but that when you're talking about religion, you're talking about the Inquisition, you're talking about the jihadists, you're not talking about somebody who wants to go to their local Anglican church once a year, maybe get the children into school, and maybe when they're at some desolate moment of their lives returns to this as the place that stores meaning. I mean, the thing that I think Jordan and I are in agreement on in this is that thing, with a quote from Schopenhauer in the Dialogue on Religion, when he says, that truth may be like water, it needs vessels to carry it. And when we were talking about this the other night, you admitted that one of the consequences perhaps of the parents sort of going through the belief structures they may not believe in anymore, but they keep doing it, is a demonstration of what you said was the non-embarrassing options that atheists have come up with. But it may also be that since we don't have very many vessels, that cracked and damaged and sometimes transparent as they are, what vessels you have might be worth holding on to.
Well, no, I think the challenge here is, it feels that, first of all, we should first notice that these comments very often take the form of, you and I don't need this stuff, but most other people do, right? And that is,
it can do that, yeah.
Yes, that's inevitably, and it sort of took that form at one moment the other night, where you acknowledge that people of low intelligence are best placed in a conservative paradigm, a traditionally conservative paradigm, because there's less to think through. Right now, obviously, you don't want your view on religion summarized by "it's good for stupid people."
Well, I do want it summarized to some degree that way, because one of the things
yes,
we do.
I'm giving you the opportunity again to put this foot in your mouth.
But I would say not only. The thing is that we're all stupid, and some of us are far stupider than others.
But we're not. But we're not that stupid.
But there's another problem, Sam. I think, and this is obviously a contentious one. And one of the things I don't go to church, but there is one thing I admire about the church, and that is that it's managed to serve as a repository for these fundamental underlying fictions for 2 millennia. And that's really something bloody unbelievable. The great, what would you say?
It is bloody unbelievable.
Well, look, Sam, everything's soaked in blood. We have no disagreement about that, but the secular alternatives that we produced in the 20th century were certainly no less blood-sodden, and they produced nothing of any productivity whatsoever.
We need not do it now, but we have to put to bed that secular canard.
What would you do?
Well, it's just not so that Stalinism was the product of secularism or atheism, and nor were
well, it was a product. It wasn't an inevitable product or the product.
It wasn't. And please, anyone who has this meme in your head, please just allow the next sentences I speak to just push it out, because I'm so sick of hearing this. This idea that the greatest crimes of the 20th century were somehow the product of atheism. Right. When you look at what actually engineered these atrocities, it was something that looked very much like a religion. It was a religion in every way apart from an explicit commitment to otherworldliness. It was based on
that's a big difference. Dogmatism
through and through. It was based on personality cults that grew up around figures like Stalin and Hitler and Mao. It was not the ideas of Bertrand Russell and David Hume that brought us to the Gulag or to Auschwitz.
Yes, but then you can't say it's the thought of Jesus Christ either. I mean,
well, no, it's true. No, I can say that. I can say it was the thought of St. Augustine, and I can say it was the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas explicitly that gave us the Inquisition. This is a fact.
Can I make a suggestion?
Yeah.
I mean, this is a general one as well as one for tonight, but the whole discussion, I mean, I said the other night in Dublin that to a great extent, when the history books are written about the period we're living in, they'll probably be described as the post-Holocaust period in history, the post-World War II era in Europe. It's still going on. So we're still going through this, trying to work out what happened. And I have to say, one thing that I, at any rate, am equally tired of is the claim that this has got to be a tennis game between the religious and the non-religious. That people say that the 20th century's crimes were committed by atheists. Sometimes true, often wrong. Or that the 20th century's crimes were committed by people who were religious. Sometimes true, often wrong.
No, but you're not observing a crucial distinction here, because I would never be tempted to hold religion accountable for the bad things that religious people do that have no connection to religion. Right? So if a Muslim robs a liquor store, I'm not going to blame Islam for that. Right? There's no doctrine.
Not then.
There's no doctrine.
Especially not then.
There's no doctrine that makes sense of that behavior. What I blame religion for, and likewise, there's no doctrine in the mere loss of religion, i.e. atheism, that gets you the Gulag.
Well,
right?
hang on. Oh, there is.
No, there's not. There's not. But let me just flesh out this point for one more second. The only thing I blame religion for are the things that it becomes rational to do by the light of these beliefs. If you accept these doctrines, a rational and good person can be tempted to join ISIS. That's my concern. A rational and good person can be tempted to support the Inquisition.
But of the many things they had in common, this is the point that David Berlinski made in his book, what did the NKVD have in common with everyone who oversaw the Gulag, the SS, the people who guarded the camps, the people who put people on trains? What did they all have in common? What did they have in common with Mao? Among other things, they had in common the fact that none of them thought that God was watching them. None of them thought that they were being observed and would be held accountable.
It doesn't help when you think God is on your side. We have just as many examples where people do it because they think God is on their side, right?
Sure.
God is watching and clapping.
I'm not denying that. I'm saying that the attempt to make this a tennis match over the 20th century is a mistake. We're still trying to work out what caused it. Religion had a role, atheism had a role. But the perpetual tennis match of it, I think.
Well, and there is something to be said at a more sophisticated level, I would say, for the idea that you have an obligation to a transcendent ethic. Now, you make that claim in the moral landscape. You lay out a transcendent ethic, in my estimation. That's one that puts the onus of responsibility on the individual to act in a way that, at minimum, minimizes suffering. And you think of that as a statement of fact, that's the proper way of being, and I think about it as an axiomatic statement of faith, and that's one of our differences. But I have been very careful in my analysis of the relationship between the idea of sovereignty and the idea of religious belief. And one of the things that I have worked out, I think, partly from reading such people as Eliade and Jung, was that there is an emergent idea of sovereignty that does involve being accountable to a God. And here's how I would justify that. And I would think about this essentially from a practical and biological perspective, independent of any metaphysical reality that it might have. So the ancient Mesopotamians, for example, believed that their emperor was the incarnation or the representative of a god named Marduk. And that actually bestowed certain ethical responsibilities on the ruler. And so the ruler had to be a good Marduk in order to be a sovereign, to be regarded as sovereign. He had to be the embodiment of these divine principles. And it took the Mesopotamians a very, very long period of time, perhaps several tens of thousands of years. They weren't Mesopotamian during that whole time, obviously, to work out what those principles of sovereignty should be. And the Mesopotamians encoded this in their fictions, in their religious fictions, making essentially the proposition that the proper ruler had to have eyes all the way around his head, because that was one of the attributes of Marduk. So he was someone who was genuinely paying attention, who was capable of coming into voluntary contact with the great chaotic substructure of being and cutting it into pieces and making the habitable world, and also speaking words that were truthful, that had the power, the magic power of truth. And the ruler had to act that out if he was going to be the sort of ruler that his people weren't entitled to slay and sacrifice. And then once a year at the New Year's festival, he would go outside the city, the walled city, and he would act out his role of Marduk. And the priest would humiliate him and ask him to confess all the ways that he hadn't been a good Marduk, so that he could remember that he had a responsibility to undertake this to embody this relationship with these divine principles. And the thing that's so important about this, that's so absolutely crucially important, is that it established the principle that even if you were at the top of a hierarchy, you weren't absolute. There was something above you that you were subordinate to. And one of the extraordinarily useful ideas about the abstraction of even God as a personified spirit, let's say, is that it allows every leader to be subordinate to something that's beyond him. Now, that doesn't mean it can't be misused, but it's a very, very, very important idea.
Yeah, except you can get there the other way around. You can realize that even if you're at the top of the hierarchy, you are radically dependent on everyone else. The tip of the pyramid.
But everybody at the tip of a hierarchy doesn't believe that. Sometimes they believe that they can do whatever the hell they want.
Yeah, but I'm saying if you're going to believe something that's compatible with rationality globally and has the least conceivable downside, I would put in that place not a superstitious attachment to a notion of an invisible friend or punisher who's above you. I would put in its place the totally defensible and palpably true fact that you could be the king of the world, and you are dependent on everyone around you to eat, to not be murdered by them. I mean, you are. I mean, it's amazing how precarious even a totalitarian regime is. I mean, the amazing thing is that these last at all, because in many cases it would just take 50 people to act in unison to kill the tyrant, right? But it never happens because you just have a first mover problem. Everyone is afraid to be the first person shot. But it is a genuine mystery that these systems even perpetuate themselves. And when they unravel, when you see Gaddafi being murdered in a crowd, you realize, wow, it really is just a matter of the restraint and fear of human beings keeping any of these things together. A benign, if you wanted a hierarchy where you had a kind of benign philosopher king pulling the reins of a society, I'm not saying we do, but even there, you could have an ethical one. You could have one where, and a non-superstitious one where someone recognized, hey, this is how we're doing it, but we are at the top of this hierarchy, am radically dependent on being surrounded by as many happy people as possible.
Well, look, I mean, I don't, in some profound sense, I don't disagree with
we're
that.
actually, I mean, this sounds like a fiction, but we're living with this problem, and we encounter this more and more when you talk, in Silicon Valley, as you and I occasionally do, and I'm sure you do as well, where you meet people who are fantastically wealthy, who seem uncannily detached at the detached at the fact that there's this growing chasm between them and those they know and the rest of humanity, and one begins to wonder what level of wealth inequality will everyone find alarming. And some people are acting as though there is no level that is alarming, that there's a kind of a law of nature that this thing can grow just impossibly to the point where we have trillionaires walking around and in driving in their motorcades, and it's kind of it's sort of the libertarian religion one occasionally runs into, and clearly there's some level of inequality that's untenable, or at least would be undesirable. I mean,
well, it's a funny thing, because that's a place where our thought loops and then agrees to some degree again, because I do believe that you can, in some sense, rationally derive an ethic. So let's take the argument that you put forward and say that, well, and this is an extension of your well-being argument to some degree, which I've thought about a fair bit. It's like, well, okay, what's the optimal solution for you? Well, okay, well, first of all, there isn't just you now. There's you now, and you tomorrow, and you next week, and you in a year, you in 5 years. So there's you and the you that propagates across time. So one of the implications of that is that you can't do anything that's really good for the you now that isn't very good for you a week from now, right?
Yeah.
So that means you have to imagine yourself as multiple individuals across multiple time frames. And then you have to figure out what's good for all those individuals across all those time frames, although you discount the future to some degree because of its unpredictability. But then, so that's a very tight set of constraints. And you might say, well, a rational person would calculate what was optimal across all those multiple time frames. Then you do the same thing with other people, which is the point you just made. Well, it isn't just you, because who's you? There's you and your family. And most people are in a situation where they would regard damage to their family as perhaps even worse than damage to them. So whatever they are obviously encapsulates their family, and then to some degree that flows off into the community. And so there is no isolated you, and that's sort of your point with regards to the ethic. But then, so I agree with all that, but then one of the things that I would suggest is that, because that's an incredibly difficult rational calculation, and perhaps an impossible one, technically speaking, but certainly very difficult, that what has happened in part as our great narratives have emerged across time is that we have observed ourselves attempting to solve that multiple identity, multiple time frame problem, and we've told stories about people who do that exceptionally well, and then we've winnowed out those stories, and we've produced these powerful narratives that encapsulate the ethic that does in fact reflect that wisdom. And and I think you actually accept some of that in your moral propositions, which is something that we've talked about before. So for example, although never really agreed on, you certainly believe, for example, that the embodiment of truth is one of the means whereby you solve the problem of ethics. And I would say that that's a deeply rooted Judeo-Christian concept, that the truth
it's so
above
deeply
all,
rooted that it precedes any notion of religious provincialism. I mean, it's deeper than Judeo-Christian. It's deeper than our humanity on some level. At one point, we talked about the golden rule, and I said that the precursor to the golden rule can be found even among monkeys, right? The golden rule is a good rule even for monkeys.
Yes, exactly. And so,
but let me just add to the picture you sketched out. I completely agree with. We have an ethical obligation even to our future selves, right? I mean, we are in relationship to who's going to be the person who's drinking his fourth scotch tonight has some ethical relationship to the person who's going to wake up with a hangover tomorrow morning. And one thing we know for sure, and which we have begun to dimly understand and describe scientifically, is that we are bad at all of these calculations,
Yes.
right? Like
Yes.
the hyperbolic discounting of future rewards.
Well, that's
and-
also why I think we have these stringent limitations on rationality, Sam, is that we can't solve the problem through calculation.
Well, no, but we increasingly can, and even where it's best summarized not by one thing I'll grant you is that it's not always best conveyed or rendered indelible and actionable by being given a nature paper or an abstract from a paper in the literature and being told this is the way you want to behave to maximize your well-being. It may best be conveyed by certain stories, right, or certain books that are in the philosophy section of the bookstore, not the science section. And you and I were at the book signing the other night, and someone came up with a copy of the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, right? A fantastic book. I mean, there's so much wisdom in that book, right? And there's nothing about stoning a girl to death if she's not a virgin on her wedding day. Now, we all recognize that Marcus Aurelius was a human being who wrote this book, and that provenance is no barrier to taking the book deadly seriously. It's an incredibly useful book, and Stoicism could be the quote religion or the guiding philosophy of the West. It would be a much better one than Judaism or Christianity, and have virtually none of the downside. And so that's my point, that we're in this perverse circumstance of being held hostage by certain products of literature. And we need to break the spell. And if we're finding it this hard to break, what do we think is going to happen in the Middle East or in sub-Saharan Africa? I mean, the moral progress we need to engineer is a common humanity coming together across shared values.
Those are perfectly credible arguments, but the weakness in the argument, I think, is the one that we started to talk about earlier, which is that when you talked with Dave Rubin a while back, and Michael Shermer said the same thing recently, he basically said that atheism is a doctrine of negation. That's what
Yeah.
you said with Rubin, is that there isn't a positive ethos in atheism. All it says is that there's nothing personified. There's nothing personified transcendent. It's something like that. There is no God, and so the problem with the atheistic
It's not even the assertion that there is no God. It's just that it's a failure to be convinced by any of the gods on offer. It's just like not believing in Zeus.
Fine, and it's not like it's
yeah.
a weak. It's not like it's a weak argument. I mean, I'm perfectly aware that making a deistic case or a case for religion in the face of the claims of the rationalist atheists is perhaps, well, it's a very, very difficult thing to manage. But it is also the case that, and this is where I think we differ with regards to what happened, say, in the Soviet Union and perhaps to also in Nazi Germany, is that when your doctrine demolishes let's call it the literary or fictional substructure and leaves nothing behind, an ethos needs to be provided, because something will rush in to fill the void. And it's certainly the case, and this is what Nietzsche warned about, even though he was a strident anti-Christian, and it's also what Dostoevsky foresaw. He said, if we knock out the logos from the substructure of Western society, Nietzsche believed that it was Christianity's emphasis on truth that destroyed Christianity, which was an extremely interesting criticism, that Christianity had elevated truth to such a degree that it actually resulted in the demolition of its own dogmatic substructure. But be that as it may, Nietzsche's prognostication was that if we allowed God to die, and perhaps there were reasons for that, that the consequence would be that we would be awash in both nihilism and totalitarian bloodshed, and that is what happened in the 20th century. And
there's another aspect to that, which is that you may try to knock out the whole thing and take out some of the substructure, but not the whole thing. That's what Nietzsche also shows. That his prediction, and I think it's blindingly obviously true, that you might in this post-Christian era have a remnant of Christianity such as guilt, overbearing guilt, and no means of alleviation or redemption.
Right, which is actually part of the problem of Protestantism, by the way,
right.
Because it's, and there are other things too that seem to be that seem to be fundamental religious issues that secularists, I think, have a difficult time accounting for. It's like, so you actually have to grapple seriously with the problem that a doctrine that's essentially one of negation doesn't offer a positive ethos. And you are doing that, to be perfectly fair. You said that reading a Nature paper about the necessity of calculating your ethic across multiple timeframes and multiple persons doesn't have the motive force that's going to drive you to act ethically in life. And I do believe that's true, but I think the fact that the rationalist ethos doesn't have motivational push is actually a fatal flaw.
They don't meet every week to read Marcus Aurelius. That's a big problem.
And they don't write music. Like, there's no music that goes along with it. There's no art that goes along with it. There's no architecture that goes along with it. Like, and I don't know why exactly.
But to be fair to the present, most music and most art and most architecture is no longer religious. I mean, that it has flown the perch provided by religion traditionally. And most of what we care about in increasingly cosmopolitan and secular societies is not tied to religion in any direct way. And there are even whole religions like Judaism where you have to look long and hard to find anyone who believes much of anything that is religious. I have literally sat on stage debating what I thought was a religious rabbi who was a conservative rabbi, and when I said something that assumed that he believed in a God who could hear prayers, he threw up his hands and he said, "What makes you think I believe in a God who can hear prayers?" And I was just, I practically lost the debate just in my astonishment. It's like, what does it mean to be a conservative rabbi in this case? There are religions that have made that transition to an increasingly attenuated commitment to the truth of the doctrine, and there are religions who haven't moved an inch, right? And but I think we have to acknowledge that this movement in this direction is progress, because what it actually is at bottom is increasing sensitivity to the difference between having good reasons and bad reasons for what you believe, right? And the fact that this book has been around forever is not a good reason. The fact that Mommy told me so.
It's not a terrible reason, though, because the fact that something has lasted for that length of time at least makes the fact that it's lasted a mystery. And you can't just attribute that to casual politicking or economic circumstances. There's something. Look, the least that you can say about many of the biblical stories is that they're incredibly memorable. And that means that in some sense they're adapted to the memory structures of our minds.
So is the mythology of ancient Greece. It's incredibly memorable.
But I don't disagree with that.
All those gods are dead. The stories still can be useful,
but
the gods are dead.
Their spirit lives on, let's say.
Yeah, but it lives on in a way that is benign. It lives on in a way where you learn about them in mythology class in school, right? You don't have a fear of Hades drummed into you as a child by your parents.
The other thing that is lacking, as far as I can tell, in the rationalist doctrine, and this is something that I've observed in my clinical practice, and so one of the things that's happened over the last year is that I've had many people, especially ex-soldiers, come to my lectures who have post-traumatic stress disorder, and they say that listening to my lectures, especially the ones on good, evil, and tragedy, there's a particular lecture that I suppose you might think about as devoted to people who have post-traumatic stress disorder, and that the language of good and evil that I lay out in those lectures is actually what allows them to recover from their post-traumatic stress disorder. And dealing with people like that in my clinical practice, the same thing has been the case. If we can't transcend the language of the merely rational and move into an intense conversation about good and evil in some sense as metaphysical realities, we can't enter a realm of seriousness, conceptual seriousness, that's of sufficient depth to help heal someone who's been touched by malevolence. Because that actually is what happens to people with post-traumatic stress disorder, is that inevitably the reason that they're so shattered isn't because something tragic has happened to them, although that does happen upon occasion. It's because someone malevolent has made contact with them, and sometimes that malevolent being, let's say, or malevolent force or spirit, for lack of a better word, is something that resides within them. And so we have these limits on rational, and the reason I'm making this case is because we've already identified another limit of rational discourse. It's like, it doesn't have the motivating power of great fiction and great literature and great poetry, but it also doesn't have the healing power of language that takes the ethical realm to its extreme in some sense. And then the next problem with that, and this is something that Douglas has been contemplating, I would say, is that what evidence do we have that a merely secular representation, a rational representation of our ethic, is going to provide us with a motive force that would be sufficient for us to do such things as identify what's valuable about our culture and be motivated to sufficiently protect it, assuming that there's something worthy of protection.
But we know what a few of those things are, and they have nothing to do with what's on the inside of a church or a synagogue or a mosque. They have to do with things like free speech. Right, like the trench we are all fighting in is, at least one of them, is defense of the free exchange of ideas. And that is put in peril by many kinds of orthodoxies, but some are the old orthodoxies, the blasphemy laws, and the people who want apostates to be killed for leaving, in this case, Islam. So those are some of the sacred. I would, if we were going to list the sacred artifacts that keep our society worth living in, I think the list is going to be very long before we start getting to the actual sacred objects of any one faith. It'll be things like freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and the free exchange of ideas across boundaries. The fact that we are no longer religiously or linguistically or geographically partitioned in the ideas we can entertain.
Well, it seems to me, though, like, and this may be my own idiosyncratic reading of the domain, but when I look at something like I've often considered a cathedral dome, let's say, and there are very old cathedral domes that have an image of Christ put up against the dome, right? So as creator of the cosmos, okay? And I'm trying to look at that from a psychological and even a biological perspective. And what I see is the elevation of a particular image that represents an ideal. And so the Christ that's represented on the dome of a cathedral is something that's projected up into celestial space. So it's an ideal to which you are supposed to be subordinate, or that you're supposed to embody. And the ideal is the ideal of the logos, technically speaking. The logos, the word made flesh, which is not only the word, free speech for lack of a better term, but also the embodiment of that, elevated to the highest principle. And that is given status as the creator of the universe. And the reason for that, in part, and this is written into the Judeo-Christian doctrine right from line 1, is the idea that it's through the discourse that you value so much that we actually engender the world as such. And that is a divine principle. And it's also, in my reading, the divine image of God that men and women are made in. And so what I see in the underlying metaphysic, where you see superstition and fundamentalism, and look, fair enough, and it's not like I would ever argue that that's not a danger. I see the imagistic and dramatized representation of exactly the idea that you hold to be paramount above all else, which is your commitment to truth, expressed in speech.
Okay, well, so my concern, and this is where I started with you, is that you could give the same charitable reading of astrology, and you'd even be tempted to do it as we talk about astrology, as you showed at the outset. Now,
but I don't think why is it a charitable reading, Sam? Like, how else would you explain the existence of something like a cathedral with that image? Like, what the hell were people doing when they built that?
I'm saying we could. It's by dint of mere historical contingency and questionable luck that we're not living in a world where the cathedrals have stained glass windows with signs of the zodiac on them. Right? We could be in that world.
Well, we were
very close to being in that world.
We are in that world to some degree, because the astrological endeavor in the Judeo-Christian landscape expanded to incorporate Christianity. And there's an entire astrology of Christianity, including representation of Christ as the sun.
So
we are in that world.
So my point is that we recognize that the literal claims of astrology, the mechanism by which astrologers think it works, is intellectually bankrupt, right? And if any significant mayhem were being caused by people's commitment to astrology, if we had presidents of the United States who couldn't get elected unless they paid lip service to a literal belief in astrology, if we had presidents who were consulting their astrologers to figure out when to meet with other world leaders, right? This would be a problem that rational people would recognize. I mean, astrology can be disproven in a single hour. You just simply have to go to one hospital in one city sometime and find two unrelated children born in the same within 20 feet of each other, and follow their lives. And if they have different lives, then the signs of the zodiac mean nothing.
Part
right?
of your argument is, and validly so, is how in the world do we determine which revelatory axioms are worthy of respect and of maintenance? And fair enough, Sam.
But maybe none. Maybe not revelatory. Maybe it is just a matter of conscious agents like ourselves having better and better conversations.
Well, it is certainly partly that. It is certainly partly that. But let me explain.
Because again, revelation in my book is nothing other than the record of past conversations. So you've either got Iron Age conversations shaping your worldview, or you have conversations like these shaping your worldview.
Or you have both. You can have both.
Yeah,
but then you have a dialogue with the past.
But which brings me to Marcus Aurelius. I read him with great pleasure and and astonishment, frankly. I mean, it is such a modern and edifying take on ethics and one's own personal well-being, and just not being encumbered by thoughts and vanities that are so easy to cut through once you notice them, but so captivating and deranging of your life when you don't. And there's more wisdom in that book than almost any book I can name, and you don't have to believe any bullshit to honor it and use it.
Let me offer you a continued explication here. And you didn't answer my question about what all these crazy medieval people were doing, spending almost all of their excess capital building a representation of the sky and putting an image on that. So just hang on a sec. Okay. So let's talk about what it would mean to embody the truth. So there's a deep idea in Christianity that this is what it would mean. It would mean to confront the suffering of life voluntarily to its fullest, which would mean to accept the necessity of death and betrayal at the hands of your fellow men without undue bitterness. To accept that voluntarily and to still understand that your fundamental ethical task is to work towards the redemption of the world. And that's associated with that image that's cast upon the heavenly dome. And that isn't a charitable reading, Sam. That's an essential analysis of the fundamental doctrines of Christianity.
Yes, but I could do the same thing with Buddhism and give you a slightly different story, but nonetheless inspiring and edifying. And I could do the same thing with
you can't do it with rationality.
But I can do it with Greek. No, that's not true. I can do it with Greek mythology. I can do it with any of these domains. But the crucial bit for me is that in order to make use of those stories, I don't have to believe in revelation. I don't have to believe that you get everything you want after you die.
I'm not sure Jordan's suggesting that you do.
No, but I'm talking about the applause of conventionally religious people who think that their conventional religion is in some way cashed out or redeemed or supported by the reading you're giving now of Christ in the starry heavens. It's not, unless you're adding this other piece, which is some probabilistic claim that, yes, this book probably was dictated by an omniscient being, unlike any other book. Or maybe the Muslims are right, that Archangel Gabriel did show up to Muhammad in his cave and give him the one final revelation, never to be superseded. And just on the merits of the text, we know that's not true. We know, for all it gets wrong and all it fails to get right about the nature of our circumstance, we know that book is not the best book ever written on any topic. And here I'm speaking of the Quran, but it's true of the Bible. It's true of the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. But no one's claiming that about the Meditations, and that's a crucial difference. It's a difference that explains so much unnecessary suffering in our world. And again, what I fear about the way you talk about religion is that at the end of all these conversations, I'm still not sure what you believe on that point. frankly. And if I'm not sure, no one out there is.
Well, I don't know why you would expect to be sure about what someone believes. How do you think that any one of you are capable of fully articulating what you believe? You certainly aren't. You are not. That's completely ridiculous. You're not transparent to yourself by any stretch of the imagination. You act out all sorts of things that you can't articulate.
But how about a best guess? Yeah.
You know, if you look, let's go all cognitive neuroscience on this, shall we? 99% of your processing is unconscious. You're not capable of articulating yourselves. If you were, you'd be omniscient.
Okay,
but don't give me any nonsense about that.
But that is a. I've never heard so many people applaud an evasion of a simple question.
It was a good one, though.
Yeah.
It was a very...
Okay, honestly, yes, everything you just said about not being fully transparent to yourself is true, and you are ruled by committee in there all the time, no doubt. But I'm asking what you actually believe. I mean, there's several things I can ask. I mean, almost any one of these threads can pull the whole tapestry. But to take Christianity as an example, what do you believe about the origin of this sacred book, the Bible, Old and New Testament? Do you believe that just maybe it has a status unlike any other book, or is it simply old writing of human beings just like ourselves?
I think it's both.
Okay, so but so what does that mean? That you're saying that there's somebody who's taking dictation that is unlike any other dictation. So Homer, though creative,
Sam,
or Shakespeare, though creative, was doing something else.
It's not like we understand the sources of inspiration.
Okay, but,
you know, if you
but
talk
everyone's
to
been inspired.
People, if you talk to creative people,
yes,
you know,
okay,
they often describe themselves as something approximating a conduit through which higher wisdom is pouring.
Again, you're dodging. Shakespeare could say that, and any writer can say that. Ultimately,
yes.
Right?
And it's also the case that we would rank order those writers, which is why you pointed to Shakespeare, in terms of the generalizable validity of their revelations.
Sure.
And so, well, look, so you run into the same issue. You know, you criticize the Bible, and look, fair enough. You know, but you're also evading a very important issue, which is how do you quantitatively rank the contributions of literature without assuming that there's a hierarchy of revelation?
There's a hierarchy of wisdom. Sure, there's a hierarchy of human wisdom. I will grant you that every day of the week. But But we're talking about primates like ourselves having conversations, and this is the most important game we can play. I mean, this is the best game in town, and it has always been so. But people are imagining, and it includes, as you said at the outset, what I would call spiritual experience. And spiritual experience admits of a fact-based discussion about the nature of human consciousness. And
why do you allow that as an exception? Because
it's not an exception; it's part of the data set. So it's possible to have
so this is spiritual experience without the possibility of concretized revelation.
No.
So it's a formless spirituality that you're advocating.
No. You can have. I'm not even discounting the possibility that there are invisible entities out there in the universe far smarter than ourselves who we could possibly be in dialogue with. I mean, there are many strange ideas that we could defend to one or another degree. I mean, there are people walking around speculating that we might be living in a computer simulation, that all of this is being run on some hard drive of the future, or some alien supercomputer. Now, that you can actually, I mean, Nick Bostrom at Oxford gives a very cogent argument in defense of that thesis, right? Now, you can deal with that on its merits. I'm not saying the universe isn't stranger than we suppose or even can suppose, but one thing we know is that when you read the Bible, you can turn every page of that book, and you will not find evidence of omniscience. You will not find anything in there that someone as smart as Shakespeare, or actually a little bit dumber, could have written.
No,
right?
I don't think that's true, Sam. There are incredibly
whatever
else you might say about the biblical writings, there are incredibly potent narratives embedded within them.
So
it's impossible to write something, virtually impossible to write something like Cain and Abel. It's a paragraph long, and it's absolutely
you're saying the
unforgettable.
Shakespeare of 3,000 years ago couldn't have written Genesis?
He couldn't have written Cain and Abel, not in 10
So,
sentences.
so then who do
Cain
you,
and Abel is 10 sentences long.
So then
and it
who do you-
contains more wisdom than you can dig out in
Okay,
a
well,
lifetime.
so now we're getting to the nub of it. Then you think that was not the product of a human mind?
I think it was the product of a vast collection of human minds working over millennia.
Okay, so we
And
have
then
a
there's some
committee of
res-
Shakespeare's. So, but still, we're just
Sure,
dealing with
sure.
people.
Well-
We've just got people.
Well, but
and,
that's- look-
but this concession, if indeed you're making it, and I'm still not sure, is the eradication of traditional Christianity.
Look, if something is deeply wise, it's reflective of a deeper reality. Otherwise,
Yeah,
it wouldn't be wise.
I'm in love with deeper realities.
So what's the deeper reality that something as wise as the story of Cain and Abel reflects?
What's
the reality?
A landscape of mind that that either takes great training, great luck, or pharmacological bombardment of the human brain to explore. Right? There are ways to get there. There are ways to have the beatific vision, right? And we understand this to some degree, but experientially, and we can understand it to some degree by third-person methods of science. And it's not like I don't know. I mean, I've had many experiences that, if I had them in a religious context, would have counted for me as evidence of the truth of my religion, right? But because I was not brought up in a religious context, and because I spend a lot of time seeing the downside of that form of credulity, I have never been tempted to interpret these experiences that way.
Try a higher dose.
Yeah, I've tried. Believe me, yes. I'll go. I'll play that game of poker with you all day long.
You'd be surprised, my friend.
Yes. Well, maybe.
We're going to have to ask, by the way, about Q&A.
Maybe there's our next podcast.
Yeah.
Did you just see a card? Okay, so
look,
Tori,
I've got to ask all of you a question now. So we're an hour and 15 minutes into this discussion, and hypothetically, what we will do is stop and go to Q&A. But our experience so far has been that when we ask the audience, because we have done that each time, whether we've asked the audience whether we should continue or whether we should go to Q&A. So the first thing I'm going to do, and you can vote on this by making a certain amount of noise if you're inclined to do so. How many of you would like us to stop talking and go to Q&A? How many of you would like us to continue this discussion for 45 more minutes? It seems to me that it's an objective fact that the latter people have the floor.
it really is going to be a rude awakening when those applause are reversed. However.
Yeah.
Yeah.
we know
Really
it's time to
humiliating.
stop.
Just
It's
get
time to
off
stop
the
at that
stage.
point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So let me. Douglas,
I
you
would
were
have
going to
to
say
say-
something.
What
You were
was
going
that?
to ask something.
You
were gonna ask something.
Was I going to ask something?
Yeah.
Yes.
That's
I've
not putting
forgotten
someone
what I was
Okay,
on the
gonna
well,
ask.
I'll
Yes.
ask you something. Let's go back to one of the core problems that we've been trying to address, which is the apparent failure, perhaps, of the rationalist atheist types to develop an active ethos that has sufficient beauty and motivational power to serve as a credible replacement for the religious rituals. So there must be a reason why that failure has occurred,
Yeah.
right? So,
Yeah,
so
well,
do you have any
I can
sense
give,
of what
yeah,
the
I
reason
can
might
give you
be?
a short list of reasons. One is that traditionally the impulse to do that in a religious context has been fatal, right? So to declare your apostasy has been the almost as reliable a way of committing suicide as jumping off a building in most cultures and most societies for the longest time, and still is in many places, as you know, in the Muslim world. So there's been a barrier to entry to thinking creatively about alternatives to religion. And so much of atheism and secularism is just a pitched battle against the eroding power of religion. I mean, when religion really has its power, right? We know what it's like. I mean, again, I think we spoke about this at one point. The moment that it makes this most salient is, Galileo being shown the instruments of torture by men who wouldn't look through his telescope, right? I mean, that was the point of contact between untrammeled human rationality and the womb that bore it.